So I'd now like to hand over to Richard Killingwater, Founder and Creative Director of Emotional Branding.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be sharing for the first time this new research into archetypes and this new brand mapping tool, RADNB. To set the scene, let me start with a short story. A sage, hero, and lover walk into a bar, but only order one drink. Why? The answer is because they are the same person. And just like interesting people, interesting brands are not one personality. The sage, hero, and lover each conjure up a set of thoughts, feelings, and needs that help us tell a story, either as the storyteller or as a character. Brands, just like movie directors, use multiple archetypes and characters to help them tell interesting and complex stories through the way they complement each other or through the tension between them. There's a reason why it's the two Ronnies, Morecambe and Wise, Ant and Dec, because great stories, great storytellers require tension between characters. And whilst there are two of them, each with their own internal different personality traits, they come together as one. So the question is, how do you identify what's your right blend of archetypes to tell your story? Just over 2 years ago, and with the help of people like Imperial College London, we started building RADNB to answer that very question. RADNB looks to understand archetypes, how they're expressed visually through a design language, how this is used to tell a narrative, and how that supports a brand strategy. Today, we've mapped almost 2,000 brands through the lens of 60 archetypes. We wanted to be able to map every type of brand, not just a few famous consumer brands. We wanted to map the good and the bad, the B2Bs, the global and the local, those whose budgets were big and those whose budgets weren't, to build a true picture of how brands really use archetypes. To our knowledge, mapping brands through the lens of 60 archetypes has never been done before. We did this because we wanted to see in more detail than ever before how brands use archetypes to tell their story. We wanted to identify what each archetype really looked and felt like. So, in the next 30 minutes, what will we cover? Well, firstly, there is a skill to be able to tune into the nuance of 60 archetypes. Just like a master perfumer is called a nez, the French for nose, for good reason, you have to develop your nez, your ability to feel emotions with design, imagery, and words. What we learned when we tuned in is that nearly all brands are not one character. Archetypes can work together to communicate stories more powerfully, and they do this best of all when they create tension in a narrative. Working with multiple archetypes can be a challenge, so understanding when there's too many or not the right ones is important in order to manage the collective whole, the overall identity of the brand. The main factor sitting behind all of this is technology. The internet, social media, the never-ending demand for content means brands can now tell much richer, more complex narratives, making them more adaptable, able to speak to multiple audiences, and helping them achieve a sustainable advantage over time. First, let's take a step back. Brands have things they want to say, that they're innovative, that they have the right solution. Stories, as we know, are a great way to connect random elements and put them together in a way that helps us learn. Once a brand has identified what it wants to say, it can then identify how it wants to say it. Choosing an archetype or a blend of archetypes, either as a storyteller or as a character, loads the story, as we said, with more meaning. For example, by telling this narrative through the voice of the creative, we can tell the story one way. We can emphasize certain values and behaviors, as each archetype carries with it specific feelings. Each archetype has its own narrative, its own emotions and needs that help you tell a story more powerfully. As we calibrated and built the model, we talked to marketeers from around the world to get their feedback. While we did this, we learned that many avoided or were reluctant to use archetypes directly, at least overtly as labels or at board level, because of a lack of credibility. If you have to choose from one of 12, and here we see the 12 primary archetypes, this can be seen both limiting and crude. Consumers also find it hard to tune into all but a few of the classic archetypes, like the hero and the lover. Many other archetypes, although felt, are not easily recognized. Within the industry itself, definitions are varied and vague and open to individual interpretation. I can remember on several occasions marketing directors saying there's no way the chief executive is going to sign up to us being the magician. We're not Paul Daniels, who, by the way, isn't the magician archetype. He's part of the jester family. If you Google or try to learn about archetypes, you'll often find the same few famous brands used all the time, meaning that for many marketeers, especially in a B2B world, archetypes feel irrelevant, not professional, and so don't know how to use them effectively. One B2C brand that I'm sure you'll have come across is Harley Davidson. And if you Google them, they come up as the iconic rebel archetype. Yet, clearly, neither of these homepages feel like a rebel brand. There is a reality gap between the headlines and how brands really communicate. So which archetypes exist in Harley? What archetypes are used by Barber to tell their story? Do they have one dominant archetype, or do they blend several, each coming to the front at different times? How differentiated are they from others in their sector? Before we start exploring these two brands and others in more detail, let us see how good your archetypal nose is. How many archetypes can you see or feel in this corporate video from Telefonica? Have a good look at the images and the words. Can you recognize which images feel the same? What archetypes are being communicated in each frame? Which ones jump out? Which take a while to tune into? Do you know what you're looking for? Do you have a list in your mind to check against? If I say the caregiver, the explorer, the futurist, the athlete, do these now appear where before you couldn't label them? What about the liberator? How different would the images of the cyclist and the runners feel if they were just by themselves? Is there an aspect of the companion within the athlete? How does the couple dancing change how you may feel about the two cyclists above looking at the sunset? How do these different archetypes work together to tell the story? Until we can better understand what each archetype looks like, it's hard to identify them. It's hard to understand how they work together. We can easily be blind to their use, especially the more subtle ones. Once pointed out, however, they're easier to find. Regardless of whether you see them immediately or not, they are there. And they are there for a reason. Telefonica, like many brands, has many stories to tell. They want to talk about being more human, a global player, ability to anticipate the future. So brands are not one character, but a blend for a reason. De Beers is not just the lover, as is often quoted, but the creative and the sovereign. It's also a blend of the guardian, seeker, provider, and shaman. So how do we measure all of this? How do we map a brand's personality? Because brands feel different. They have different personalities. Currently, you can choose from your own set of values, or you can choose from one of the 12 primary archetypes, or select from hundreds more. You can use AI or crowdsourcing to scrape content. RADNB hopes to take this to the next level, to give you greater clarity through the visual dataset of 60 archetypes. RADNB is built around opposing emotion needs. We all experience daily tension between 6 core opposing needs. For example, to varying degrees, we all have a need for variety, but we also have an opposing need for certainty. So we started by positioning each primary archetype based on their emotional need between the 6. For example, out of all the primary archetypes, the sage has the greatest need for certainty, while the jester has the greatest need for variety. By placing these archetypes on the map, you are starting to explore the spectrum of human emotional needs. But as we implied, 12 does not give us enough detail. So we identified where to position each of the 4 subfamily members within the map. Now, each archetype has these 4 family members, and they themselves are positioned relative to the 6 needs. Behind each of these archetypes is a visual data set of real brand images that helps you to bring to life the emotional needs and feelings of the archetypes. For the first time, we can look and say, this is what an adventurer feels like. This is what a shapeshifter or a visionary or a muse feels like. But images are rarely just one archetype. Most of these images are in themselves a blend of archetypes. So through RADNB, we are able to identify what certain combinations of different archetypes look and feel like. So once we have a data set, we can start seeing more clearly how brands use archetypes. So let's go back to Harley and Barbour. How similar do you think they are? They certainly feel similar here. When we see sample videos, stills, websites, literature together, you start to feel how similar these two brands are. In fact, Barbour's recent video campaign, here on the right, feels far more like a rebel than Harley's video on the far left. When we look at the map and where the brands are positioned, we can see which archetypes they use. We see the similarities and where they're different. With both Harley and Barbour, the patriarch is in fact the strongest archetype, more than the rebel. Although one patriarch may be on a bike and the other walking on an estate, both tell a story of seeking a close connection, a position of status within their community, while also having a sense of independence and exploration. Both blend the patriarch, rebel, companion, seeker, and hero to tell this story. We look at lots of maps, and from these, we've been able to see patterns that reflect what we call the 3 dimensions of a narrative. The first dimension is the about me story. When a brand wants to stand out or fit in by telling you what they do, the second dimension is when a brand is more focused on the customer and making them feel something in that moment. And the third dimension is when a brand looks to empower you like a coach. When we look at 3 business schools, with Harvard on the left, we see just a few archetypes. This is partly because they have a simple message, but usually they want to simply talk about one thing, themselves. And that's fine for certain brands in certain positions. With London Business School in the middle, we see a more expansive pattern. London Business School still wants to talk about themselves from a position of status, but also to weave in their narrative the student story, one that in their case is about a supportive community. If we look at IE Business School, we again see similar areas, but like busy bees, they appear to be working harder to talk about their story through the use of more archetypes. In IE's case, their narrative talks about their new approach to teaching in a virtual world. This requires more archetypes. This is a more complex story. So, can you overdo it? Clearly you can. If your narratives and archetypes don't match, don't blend properly, there is a possibility of disconnect to the story. Here, we see a classic B2B page, promoting product in a very clean, neutral way. But even this contains some subtle blends of archetypes through its use of colors, through the layout. But when we expand on this page, we can see even more archetypes introduced through the visionary product style shots and the See Ahead, Change Tomorrow campaign created in a more futuristic archetypal style. When you actually dive in to that video itself and look at the actual slides, you see more archetypes appear like the caregiver. Then you explore other pages on the website and the product pages and introduces even more archetypes. When we look at then the whole of their map, we can see there is a potential for a narrative to flow. But when you look at the layout, there is no focus. Each story is not given the time to build momentum or depth. So whilst a lot of the map is covered, it is in a random way. In contrast, if we look at Peloton, we can see an equally diverse portfolio of archetypes, but they are more centered, more clustered around archetypes that align well to their story. Another example, Too Good to Go and Innocent. Both brands feel similar. Both use the innocent archetypes as part of their mix. But the different blends of archetypes they use is different, which means that people can actually interpret a single piece of communication quite differently, even though that piece feels the same. So mapping Too Good to Go's communication, we see their innocent archetype in the bottom left-hand corner, expressed through the idealist and muse archetypes more. Then it goes up through the activist, the reformer, and up to the sage, and the solution provider, that is the detective. We can also see an equal balance between the need for self-growth and the provider on the bottom left, and the need for contribution to others expressed through the healer, bottom right, plus a splash of humour as a provocateur in the top right. With innocent, we see them firmly grounded in the innocent archetype, but with a shift to the right-hand side of the map towards the most heroic archetype, that is the rescuer. Here, we see two pieces of communication, one from each brand, both trying to communicate similar messages and both having a very similar feel. However, the overall feel of the archetypes used by each brand can impact how people respond and feel about that. So because of Too Good To Go archetypes are more about actively campaigning for a better solution and use the detective and activist, their campaigns can feel that they are about providing real solutions. The innocent archetype wants you to feel good. The innocent brand wants you to feel good, but in their case, more like a hero. And they're bringing in that hero archetype. Now they use the activist, but it can get overpowered by the other archetypes. So whilst it's there, it's just not coming through as well. Meaning that whilst innocent is trying to drive social change with his campaign and use the activist archetypes at times, Too Good's use of its archetypes are potentially more effective in influencing change. A review of archetypes wouldn't be complete without looking at Apple and how their narrative runs from the engineer, a subset of the magician, through to the reformer, a part of the rebel family, down through to the maverick, into the creative artist and storyteller. A beautiful spine that runs through their brand, which other archetypes blend into in various campaigns in different ways to tell that brand story. With Saucony and Adidas, we can see how unique stories are formed, even within sectors that can often feel very similar. While both fit in the hero family, Saucony is more of a seeker and activist in its archetypes, while Adidas follows a similar route to Apple from reformer to creative, which means their narrative can express, like Apple, more the idea of individual creativity. Different patterns, the spacing between archetypes, where archetypes are on the map, and the number of archetypes used all help indicate not only the story, but also the strategy of the brand. With these 6 brands, again, in a sector that's often hard to differentiate one brand from another, you're able to see the difference. We can look at the sector as a whole and see which archetypes are prominent. And from these prominent archetypes, like the sage, detective, visionary, and guide, we can identify easily, because of the nature of their storytelling, what the story is for that sector. And you can calculate how far a brand is from the mean average of the actual sector. We can also interrogate different sectors and see how they compare. We can also see what archetypes generally come together to help tell that story. So RADNB helps you tune into a brand's unique blend of archetypes. It gives you a better understanding of what each archetype really looks and feels like, what emotional needs each brand uses within its narrative, and how archetypes are used to create tension in a story. RADNB is building a community of experts that can identify the visual language of 60 archetypes, helping us better understand how stories are told through a blend of archetypes.